just lost interest. It's because they have questions and they can't get serious answers to their questions. They get dismissed or they get a hostile reaction of, this is kufr. To even ask the question is kufr. For some of them, it's because of personal issues that they're trying to deal with. Rather than try to summarize all my experiences during my era of chaplaincy, I'll focus on my own family. Because while many people leave Islam, in fact, a handful who do become Christians, it seems, are people whose parents were abusive. And sometimes used Islam as a tool of abuse. But even in families where the parents are loving, as in my own family, I'm one of, as those of you who know from the quiz we passed around, I'm one of four boys, and the only one who's a practicing Muslim. And the others all left for different reasons and in different ways. One doesn't really believe in God, though he remains kind of spiritual in that abstract sense that we see so many people being. Another has turned against God with a vengeance. And another is gay and just doesn't feel that there's any room for gay people in any religion, including Islam, and therefore has no interest in it and even some hostility. Now, I picked my own family because these are people I know well, but these are things that I see reflected in the general student community we have to deal with. And these are the problems we have to confront about how are we going to deal with these challenges. Now, what I've said is just really introductory, but that's so I don't take up too much time, and so I let my distinguished co-panelists get to carry the heavy burden. But I'll be back in a moment for a conversation with her, and then hopefully with all of you.
Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You asked me to introduce myself. My name is Aysha Wazwaz. I was born in Minnesota to a Palestinian and half Palestinian, half Spanish Paraguayan mother. And I grew up in the US and in Palestine for some time of my life. And my husband is Tunisian and also an author for over 14 different books on Islam and Christianity, Islam and atheism. That's really his field. I have a bachelor's degree in Islamic law, fiqh, and a master's degree in contemporary Islamic studies, in where my dissertation was about the portrayal of Islam in the neoconservative media. The PhD I did on the writings of Karen Armstrong's writings on Islam and scrutinizing her works to see whether they are academic from the Islamic literature or not, and how much are they academic in terms of studying Islam. Alhamdulillah, I finished my PhD this summer actually, and with an honors, alhamdulillah, from Janian University in Lebanon. This topic, I think it's a very attractive topic, especially at the time that we're living in, the age of postmodernism. And in my lecture, inshallah, I'm going to be discussing certain issues, hopefully that I can do it really fast in order to cover a number of issues. Number one, it's to answer the questions, what is the reason behind youth confusion? Is leaving theism or Islam a phenomena? Has this happened before in history? Is atheism one type or more? And are the motives behind religious confusions the same? And is it a reaction to religious, cultural, and philosophical or religious confusion? Is there a relationship between religious, cultural pressures and confusions and leaving Islam? Is there any relationship between that? Has the religious rhetoric helped or neglected the youth's confusion? And of course, when we're looking at these questions, you might say, okay, why did you focus on atheism? The focus on atheism is really because of the time that we're living in, which is postmodernism. Postmodernism is not at all separate from atheism. In fact, postmodernism, the whole philosophy of postmodernism is really, you could consider it as the Sharia of atheism, or the law, or the constitution, or the practice of atheism. Postmodernism is really the practice of, it's really the practice of atheism, in atheism put into practice. So the way that we're going to answer some of these questions, we're going to talk about some of the reasons behind this confusion that is happening to the youth or losing their faith, and the effects on the society, and ways to help the students, and suggested reading material. But first, when we're talking about losing faith, it's very important that we differentiate between the misconceptions that relate to Aqidah, that relate to understanding Islam in itself, the understanding of God, the Prophet, peace be upon him, Quran. That's more to Aqidah. And the other part, which is the desires and the whims that are promoted through the postmodern cultures. The reason why we have to differentiate between the two is because when you're discussing the first one, which is the misconceptions, you're actually discussing the philosophy of Islam, the whole idea of Islam, the whole foundation of Islam. Versus on the other one, you're challenging and you're discussing people's desires, in other words, you're discussing a behavior. And there's a difference between the motives that are behind a misconception and the motives that are behind desires or whims or a practice. Now, the first one, which is when we're looking at the misconceptions are usually, right now, it's not Christianity and Islam, but really the most common thing that I'm working with is really atheism versus Islam. The atheism versus Islam, it's not just the Muslims actually, but this is also the pressure even with the Christian and the Jewish community. It's right now working on theism versus atheism, and that's right now considered the main, you could say, confrontation, dialogue, whatever you want to call it, is really what we're seeing, even in terms of universities and etc. Versus when we're talking about the other part, which is the desires and desires and whims, etc., we're actually looking at, again, postmodernism in practice, which actually regards, because remember, postmodernism is actually a reflection, or atheism in practice, we're talking about relativity and truth. If you're talking about relativity and truth, you're talking about relativity in defining ethics and morals. When you're talking about relativity and defining morals and ethics, then you're going farther in how much and what is right, and is there anything called absolute truth or a certain defined moral to being acceptable or rejected. And I always say this, I would say that when, for example, the LGBT movement was regarded as legal by the Supreme Court, it wasn't just an issue of an LGBT movement, but it was redefining the epistemology that the US Constitution and how the West is right now seeing as the resource of, or the epistemology for defining what is right and wrong. It's not just an issue of somebody marrying somebody, but it is actually what is going to be the resource of how we define our morals and values. Is it going to be in God we trust? Or is it going to be the pressures or the lobbying that's going to be redefining everything, and how far will it go? Now, right now, we're looking at, again, the lobbies, the different lobbies, right now the secular lobbies that pretty much shape the government and pretty much school systems, etc., and the postmodern lifestyle that spread through schools, media, Hollywood, social media, and music, and of course the peers that spread the postmodern lifestyles. Now, when we're looking at the statistics, in America, according to the Washington Post, a study actually said that and found that the number of Americans who do not identify with any religion continues to grow at a rapid pace. 1/5 of the US public and 1/3 of adults under 30 are religiously unaffiliated today. The study found that in the last 5 years alone, the unaffiliated have increased from just over 15% to just under 20% of all US adults. Now, when we're looking at these statistics, these aren't separate from the Muslim world as well. Because when we're looking at the Muslim world, we're actually seeing, for example, a study that was conducted by Al Jazeera channel in the last 7 years, atheism has risen by 4% in Egypt alone. When you're looking at the numbers, when you're looking at the numbers and how it's affecting the populace, we're seeing that a number of show figures, we're seeing a number of certain actors, etc., that are actually announcing that they have left hijab, or they have left Islam, or they have now become a different lifestyle, and the list goes on and on. But this has not yet become a phenomena, but a rare behavior in a conservative Muslim society, which causes, or brings about an eye-opener to try to figure out what really happened. Denouncing religion or God, when we're looking at history, this isn't something that is new, because when we're looking at different groups throughout history, there was that religious or the divine denouncement throughout history, in where a lot of times it was a reaction to certain understanding, or certain reaction to the way that certain religions were practiced. When we're looking at new atheism today, it's not really far from that. It's not far from that type of reaction that happened throughout history, whether it was a type of a political atheism, or a state atheism, or whether it was a philosophical atheism, or whether it was a behavioral atheism. And of course, it's very important to look at these, because history repeats itself, and you cannot whatsoever not trace the ideas that happen today to what happened before in history. And when we're looking at today, new atheism in the West has its history in different philosophers. During the time of the Renaissance and Reformation, criticizing religion, it became more frequent. That was when we're looking at its history, became more frequent. Atheism as a concept later emerged as a reaction to the intellectual and religious turmoil in the Age of Enlightenment and the Reformation. Attacking religion, Catholicism, and later Christianity in general brought in deism, theism, or semi-atheism. And we're looking at different philosophers that are very, very famous, whether it's Descartes, Spinoza, Hobbes, and of course, Friedrich Nietzsche. The Age of Enlightenment was not far from that at all. You might say, okay, what do we have to do with any of this? What we have to do is that we have to remember that this was the birth of that thought that brought in the lobbies that we have today, that brought in the secular management, the secular governance, and the secular governance actually controls by these thoughts. Controls by these thoughts, and these thoughts are right now what the youth are actually learning. They're actually getting these thoughts as if it was part of education. This is part of what the final understanding of man has reached. When the students look at it as this is what the final thing that man has reached, it becomes a place of confusion for the students, because, well, this is what science is proving. This is what enlightenment is proving. Same thing when we're looking at, for example, feminism. Opposed religion, regarded religion as a main source of female oppression and inequality. And of course, when we're looking at the 21st century, we're seeing the same thing with secularism, humanism, atheism, generally promoted in the Western world, in media and schools. But the most important thing is that it's being promoted as if it's science versus religion, meaning smart versus the dumb, or the critical reading versus the blind following. Is it the peaceful versus the militant, the tolerant versus the intolerance, or tolerance versus intolerance, freedom versus oppression, enjoyment versus boring or dull, the pro-choice versus anti-choice, the logic versus myth, Now, this is generally how it's being promoted. So if you are in a society where in schools it's smart, it's science versus religion, it's critical versus blind following, what ends up happening is that the students will start to lose their self-esteem, start to lose their confidence in faith, because, well, I definitely don't want to be a blind follower, but you're put either this or that. You would need a large support in order to get you feeling that no, it doesn't have to be blind following or critical thinking. Even a religious person can be critical thinking, and this is how it's done. Now, of course, atheism, Islam generally, atheism, when we look at in Islam, of course, we know that God Almighty created the world with a purpose that preceded creation. In other words, the purpose preceding the creation is the main issue in Islam, and that's why when we're looking at world or the concept or the idea of Genesis in Islam, etc., I'm not gonna focus on that too much, but what we're seeing is that the environment in Islam, of course, environment may alter the person's instinct, but that does not change the fact that a person actually has an instinct to truth, to accepting truth, and that God Almighty had sent the prophets and messengers to talk to that instinct, to inform that instinct that God Almighty had created man for a purpose, and that this world and this creation actually has a purpose. And the most important thing when we talk about Islam in practice is that one is not supposed to submit to their materialistic drives, but actually live up to the principle. Well, that's where Islam goes in odds with atheism, because atheism regards that, well, there is no purpose, live up to your drives. But in Islam, it's no, don't let your drives drive you, but live up to the principle. And that's where that clash always takes place inside the hearts of, and and brings in the confusion within the youth. But we have to understand that not all atheism is the same. So most of the times we would get students that would say that they're atheists, but a lot of times what we are seeing is that they don't really know what atheism really means by definition. They don't really know how it stands, and what all the details of all that philosophy is not always is not always clear to those that acclaimed atheists. And that's why when we talk about atheism, people approach it differently. And some of it, when we study those cases, we realize that atheism generally would, although acclaimed by many, that's the word that is used, but a lot of it is really personal understanding. They would have a certain personal understanding to what atheism inside of them means, or philosophical, or even political. And the reactions to the world around them, and how people, or some of the Muslims, and how they react to the personal situation that they went through, or the philosophical issue, philosophical confusions in political situations, would a lot of times take them into that arena, but not necessarily atheist in the argument that it really stands for. And when we look at the different types, I know this is really small, but I'm just going to go really fast. When we look at the different types of confusions, not all of them are actually the same, because some of it is absolute atheism, meaning that they really deny God, they really don't believe in the existence of God Almighty, and that life is just matter in motion. This is really important to mention, because if you are actually regarding that life is just matter in motion, that's where Islam totally says, wait a minute, you're not just matter in motion, but you're actually created for a purpose that preceded your own creation. There are some that would define themselves as atheists, but in reality, they're actually semi-atheists. They would believe in God, but deny God's relationship to creation. There are the nihilists that reject all religious and moral principles, and believe that life is meaningless. And most of the times they would say, well, you would have to create your own meaning to life. It could be their meaning to life to take care of the orphans. It could be the meaning to life to be a famous singer or whatever. And there's that transitional temporary atheist where they're falling into that moment where they're not really understanding. They're having these troubles between culture and faith and, okay, where am I going? So they're going through this transition. And there's the atheist that research that regards that doubt is the base for researching for truth. So you're supposed to be in doubt of everything, and then continue researching for truth. Then there's the retaliation atheism, what I call is retaliation atheism, holds religion responsible for all the pains and reacts in ways of retaliation against everything religion stands for. And this is a very common thing. So she might, for example, she or he might have gone through a certain experience, so they will hold religion responsible for that, not necessarily that they have committed something wrong, but it was religion. If only I wasn't, for example, I don't know, a niqabi, I would have probably not been attacked in public, and therefore let me just go against anything that has to do with hijab, or probably even denounce Islam in everything. There's of course a revolutionary atheist who wants to revolute every single principle that I mentioned, that one, every single principle that religion stands for. There's the blackmail and pressuring atheism, used by youth to pressure their parents to give up on certain principles to gain materialistic or moral benefits. There's the show-off one, to gain attention by standing out. I'm different than my family because I would appear as if I'm the smart one, the critical thinking, and the list goes on and on. There's the bullying atheism, to gain popularity by bullying other religions. Why? You would seem smarter, you would seem more awake, critical thinking. And there's the paradigm atheism, imitate certain figures. Usually these people lack self-confidence, but they just want to imitate somebody that is popular. And especially right now when we're talking about Stephen Hawking, when we're talking about Richard Dawkins, etc., people would assume that, okay, if you're smart, therefore you should be an atheist. If you are a scientist but not an atheist, that means you're somehow following myths and blind following. There's the depression atheism, or confused about a trauma in the world or a trauma they lived through, so they reject God because they couldn't understand evil and free will, and how that, which is the problem of theodicy. Now, not all types. A lot of times we actually think that if the person defines himself or herself as atheist, that we should generally talk about evolution, and we should talk about the different arguments, the kalam argument or the cosmological argument. Not necessarily, because a lot of times people use that term and they don't really know what it stands for. And that's why not all types of confusion on religion, we deal with it in the same way. And that's why, like I said, it depends. You want to categorize to see, is this person understanding? Are they understanding what they mean by an atheist? Are they understanding what they mean with their confusion? Is it a result of a trauma? Is it a result, again, go back to right here, is it a revolution against something? Is it trying to go against the norm? Is it trying to bully others? Is it trying to gain acceptance? What really is it? And that's when we would actually go into understanding, how do I want to do that chaplaincy for that person and get them back into their faith, by first understanding what is the motive and how do they understand what they're talking about. Most of those that are living in confusion, most of them are actually living between modern life pressures. And what I mean by modern life pressures, remember, we're in the age of postmodernism, and the age of postmodernism is really pushing you that life has no meaning, therefore live up to your drives and live up to the materialistic things, etc., and enjoy, because if you're not enjoying it, you're missing out on it. Versus in religion, it stands out for a purpose in life. And the motives behind most cases are psychological, depression or different things, social, cultural, political, economical, each one. But very few are actually really believing in atheism and the evolution for what it stands for. Most of them are very shallow in knowing evolution and all the different details. And of course, it's very important to mention that even in the science world, there's actually a push towards denouncing those that believe in the intelligent design and getting them out and losing their jobs. And you could actually read more about that, but it's really interesting to know that they'll be ending up losing their jobs. They'll be ending up losing. There is a real lobby. You want to call it conspiracy, you can call it whatever you want, but at the end of the day is that if you are a scientist and not actually following a certain paradigm, you might actually end up losing your job, and eventually you're not going to be heard of. Now, the confusion that, regardless of what type of confusion, atheist or whatever, regardless of what type we would classify them into, but it ends up leading into confused behavior. When man has no purpose in life, they will make up one. They will make up some kind of a purpose. Confusion becomes the motive that affects the decision making in life, and you can study that type of atheism by studying the person's behavior and the motives that led to it. But the behavior of a confused person usually reacts in different ways. Run away from life, probably commit suicide. Two, search for soothing or calming materialistic pacifiers through ecstasy. Could be drugs, alcohol, music, sexuality, and the list goes on and on. And that's not very far from what the atheist or the previous atheist, whether it's Nietzsche, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all of them pretty much engaged in that type of ecstasy just to soothe themselves, because man cannot live without having a purpose in life. So they'll make up a purpose in life, or at least soothe themselves with these different pacifiers. Remember, we as humans, we've got these different drives. And part of the drives is the drive to know, why am I created? What's the purpose behind life? So many will try to calm that drive by engaging into other drives as soothing, as ways to soothe the other drive. Every case may have its own start, circumstance, and psychological effects. So it's not this person is going through this type of atheism, therefore they have the same story. No, they might have had a certain story and that it ended up in a certain type, or it may be a number of different types that affected this person's definition of how they define themselves and losing their faith. But when we're talking about those different cases, it's very important to not understand that, like I said, not all of them you necessarily would have to go and discuss and go into the philosophical arguments, because many will enjoy those arguments because it feeds their sense of confidence. And of course, the argument by belittling religion, and not because they necessarily have an answer to their confusion. So a lot of times they'll go into those confusions, and oftentimes they'll throw out all these misconceptions one after another, and they won't even give you the time to answer a question. They'll just go into talking about the Prophet ﷺ, why did he do this, in Quran, and all these different things that they've been reading, and in the end is that they'll use the condescending method because it gives a sense of confidence and victory. So they'll give you they'll belittle the person with the religion because it gives them a sense of that I won. I'm confident in what I'm saying. Questioning things that sometimes no one has answers for about their own personal experience. So they might say, well, my father, for example, divorced my mother, and my mother married another man who was hitting her, and he was religious, and he was ordering me to do my salah, etc. And that becomes, okay, here's that experience. And then they want you to answer, why did this happen? Well, I don't know what that person was doing, and I don't know the details of what happened, but expect you to answer something that is relating to their own experience. And of course, you can't necessarily do that. You don't even know the details of their life. And plus, we don't necessarily have the data of what is going to happen in their future. Most confusion or atheist cases are not treated by religious or philosophical arguments or dialogue, because the motive of their confusion is personal, such as a trauma or breaking taboos. Now, breaking all the taboos and living to feed pleasure is usually the most important reason why many also would actually choose atheism as a way. Because even historically, breaking taboos and denying principles is the first motive behind atheism, no matter who and what is behind the principle. So it's trying to break the principle, and even throughout history, it was always trying to break the taboos and go beyond it and live to the drive. And that's something that we also see people that adhere to atheism actually live to that type, where Nietzsche, Rousseau were known for their illicit engagement and engagements generally, and don't need to go into the details of that. What results in breaking all the taboos? Joining in the public culture without feeling guilt is the second motive. You want to do what everybody else is doing, rather than living up to the principle that usually requires inner and outer struggle. It's hard to work on an inner and outer struggle, but it's easier to just, if you can't beat them, just join them. And that will give you the feeling of victory, that will give you the feeling of power. And of course, to remove the guilt, the person will always accuse religious personas of being hypocrites and expose their mistakes to get a sense that they're not better than I. And in that the person will get a sense of being better by saying, at least I'm not a hypocrite. I'm doing exactly what you're doing in private, and instead, or use I'm being myself as an excuse and justification to not live up to the principle. And at many times accusing religion and religious figures of being totalitarian or using their power for theocracy and controlling others. Rejection of religion becomes an ego issue and not an argument per se. And this is really important to say, that it's not necessarily an argument for me to discuss with them or try to, get them out of it. It's usually just a personal issue or rejection of religion because they just want to break all the taboos and just do what they want to do. Retaliation atheism is a very important thing to comment on, because there is no doubt that some religious personnels have and may have motivated a reaction to certain rhetoric or triggered a sentiment of retaliation. There's no doubt about that, such as interfering or putting religion in areas that has nothing to do with religion. And they'll really, unfortunately, talk about religion in areas and not understand. And most of the times it's because people lack fiqh, lack Islamic understanding, and will actually regard, oh, you're not religious enough if you don't do it this way, because I saw the sheikh do it that way. And what happens is that the person starts feeling that religion is shackling them or tangling them in every single corner, when in reality, as a fiqh expert, by the way, it's so strange. We've got an Islamic hotline for women. I actually get phone calls of people calling me, telling me that they're constipated and how Islam tells them to deal with it, or other people telling me that they're going through some kind of mental issue. How do they deal with it? So, unfortunately, the public doesn't usually understand where religion begins and where it ends, and a lot of times, you're being put in that spot where people don't understand how to practice Islam and how to teach it to others. And that's why when we're looking at even some religious personnel where they're being too utopian, or haram police that does not necessarily reach out to the heart, but try to tangle others, you should not be doing this, and start attacking. And of course, the reaction to this religious religious groups actually reacting in that way is that many will associate the religion with the people that adhere to that religion. And of course, leaving religion becomes more common when religiosity is practiced in wrong ways. And many times, again, leaving religion becomes a reaction when outer features are focused on rather than spiritual. And spiritual that does not affect behavior. This is another type where people will start, you know what, I'm going to leave this. And they'll basically react in that way when, or pragmatic and not necessarily benefiting oneself. They realize that the imam is just working for his position, that the board are just working for their position and not necessarily for the benefit of the Muslim community. The totalitarian, action is, I'm not going to listen to them and I'm just going to basically leave the religion in total, or run away from pain and trauma, where I'm going through lots of pains and traumas, or people are dealing with the religion in that way because they're going through pain and trauma. Therefore, they're not rational to understand what's going on with them. Therefore, their religion is causing them to succumb to the pain and trauma. But I can think of things in different ways. So what happens is that the general a Muslim community dealing with Islam or religion in a certain way will actually have certain people to react in a different way and leave the religion. And of course, at the end is that what happens is that the religion or Islam will be accused of being mythical, irrational, is the common argument given by those people that see this. The other part is trying faith as an experiment. It has become common that many will trial faith as a scientific experiment and actually live in a number of faiths for some time, not realizing that religion is not studied by practice or experiment, but by text and argument. So things like, for example, terms they'll use, I didn't feel, I didn't see, I tried this and it didn't work, and talking about a certain or outer feature or practice of Islam as an experiment is common. So you'll hear a woman saying, oh, I was Salafi one day, I was wearing a niqab, and really I was not feeling Islam right. Or another Sufi, oh, I engaged in dhikr and I did dhikr, but I didn't feel anything. Or if they're Ikhwan, I was engaging in community service, it's all hypocrisy. And of course, what happens is that when we look at these waves and people dealing with it as an experiment, what you end up seeing is, of course, it becomes that the reality is that it's a wave and not always a personal experience, but a lobby that is controlled by schools, media, and governed by secular politics and governance. Where religion is banned from schools, and public schools are secular and teach this mentality. Who's the responsibility lying on? It's not just one side, but we're talking about Muslim leaders that lack awareness in knowing the Islamic stance on many issues risen. And of course, giving the general personal perspective based on general text as if it was the Islamic stance. So many of those scholars will actually just give their own opinion and not necessarily what Islam really says about it. Most Muslim leaders, unfortunately, are not qualified to research in Islamic resources. And unfortunately, again, what happens is that Muslim masses start following the deviation that many leaders are promoting and not necessarily what Islam really says, and end up in the secular atheist confusion. So it's an Islam with an atheist core. It's Islam with a secular core. And you end up actually seeing all those different things. Well, there's definitely some trouble with Muslim scholars because many Muslim scholars, there's a language barrier, cultural barrier. Students don't have access to those scholars. Scholars generally are not specialized on atheism questions and end up not getting involved with the youth's lives. This is very common. Now, the responsibility also goes on Islamic centers and MSAs. So Islamic centers are still confused about their status. Is it a mosque or is it an Islamic center within a Western society? The classes that are taught are usually focused on emotional or religious emotions rather than building an Islamic understanding to both philosophies, the philosophies and the cultures around them. Imams are usually not qualified to answer the questions. Unfortunately, in our times, what makes you an imam is just that you memorized Quran or have some kind of a 2-year degree in Islamic studies, and that makes you an imam. Now, the person that is coming to the masjid doesn't realize that doesn't necessarily make that person a scholar. what makes a scholar, and in fact don't realize that even in Islam there are different specialties. There's fiqh that's different than tafsir, aqidah different than hadith, and the list goes on and on. The same thing, we could actually see the MSA's confusion as well. The MSAs, where we would assume that the MSA, very active, knows what they're doing, or at least trying to help the students understand the Western society and their Muslim identity. But you actually see that the MSA is confused about their role. Is it to bring awareness to themselves, to others, or is it both? They're active 1 week in a semester, and it usually ends up a cultural gathering. And of course, most of the times they're also confused on how to make the funds for the activities that help them understand the duality of the religious and Western identity. And in the end is that they failed to pressure the students' council to have a Muslim chaplain in school. So when they do have a Muslim chaplain, most chaplains are not qualified because the school is not aware of the academic qualification for a Muslim chaplain, or they will not pay them fairly for the job. Chaplaincy ends up being a missed position, and missing that position actually leaves it, okay, well, the child or the youth is going to go for the parents. But the parents themselves are usually second generation, confuse culture and religion. So she will say it's haram to do that, or pressure a certain thing, confuse culture and religion, don't know where religion begins and where it ends, and end up, well, my Desi family did this, my Arabi family did this, therefore this is what you're going to do. Unaware of the challenges that students go through in order to seek resources. And what they end up is that the family themselves tries to answer the questions, and they'll answer it based on their own experience. What the youth is going to think is that Islam failed to answer my questions. I went to the imam, he didn't have an answer, or at least a good argument. The MSA doesn't look like we can actually be active. Number 3, the parents, they didn't have an answer. The imam or the scholar, I went to the scholar, he doesn't speak English. Then what? Then, well, I guess there's no answer. Chance that. And then what ends up is that the effects on the students and the society is that they would either make up a new Muslim stance away from Islam. They're Muslim, but it's like, okay, I want to preserve my identity. That brings in a confusion. I want to preserve, yes, I'm Muslim, but I'm actually something else at the same time. Why? Because I still need to engage, I still need to adapt to the political lobbying that's around me. And you would see those different groups, for example, or the different examples, Irshad Manji, Asra Nu'mandi, Linda Sarsour, Amani, Al-Khatatbeh, and pretty much living, okay, how do I actually understand Islam, and how do I put all that together? Muslims losing their confidence in Islam, mainly because they don't have access to the answers to their questions. Every factor has its own way of solving it. I don't know how much time I've got, but I saw him.
Wrap up, yeah.
I gotta wrap up. Okay. I'll try to wrap up right here. I'll go really fast.
I'm sorry,
Right. What I'll do, I'll make it really fast. So I think it's very important when we're talking about the Muslim community versus atheism. Within the Muslim academic area, the Muslims did not have atheism as an issue throughout history as an issue. It's not that there wasn't. In fact, they were called the Dahriyin. There were some people that were atheists within the Muslim community. There were LGBT as well within the Muslim community. I'm not talking about today. I'm talking about in Andalus. I'm talking about Al-Abbasi period. Those things existed. But today, new atheism actually uses the different forms of explaining itself. And the Christian apologists have actually done massive work in discussing those different arguments. And I think it's very important that we benefit from those arguments, whether it's the beginning of creation, cosmological argument, the Kalam argument, the theodicy question, and the problem of evil. And some of the most important scholars that the Muslim community can actually benefit from are Professor John Lennox, Dr. William Lang, Frank Turek, R.C. Sproul, Stephen Meyer, Anthony Flew. Although it's very important to mention that all these scholars are actually very anti-Islam. All right, they're very anti-Islam, but it's very important they're very anti-Islam, very anti-Muslim, and they would ridicule Islam, etc. But when we're talking about the atheist argument, I think it would be smart to actually use the argument in place and to learn from even those that are attacking Islam on issues like atheism and so forth. And this is the end of my talk.
Thank you very much.
Yes, but yeah.
Well, Sister Sheikha has done, as I threw the burden on her, doing the heavy lifting, she's done that. Before we open it up to everyone, I had a couple of questions myself. One is, I was not sure if this was a typo or a profound statement in your draft when you said that creation proceeded from purpose, or did you mean to say that purpose preceded? Oh yeah, preceded. Okay, so yeah, it's a typo. All right. Yeah. Then one of the things I'm concerned about is I think that one has, and your statistics showed this, only a small fraction of the nuns, as they call them, people who have nothing to do with organized religion, are actually atheists or agnostics. So, but am I correct that you still think that the reason that they are nuns is because of this atheist culture?
So I mentioned that we can't necessarily have, people actually have so many different experiences. So we cannot necessarily say, okay, this person is a nun, she left religion, therefore this is the reason why. Because there can be more than one reason. There can be more than one reason, but it's very important not to deny the atheist in the postmodern pressure. That's what I'm trying to get to. Okay? It's very important not to deny it, but it doesn't mean that every single person that had become in that way, that means that they were succumbing to the pressure.
Okay. And then you gave a smorgasbord of a list of the kinds of atheism. Mm-hmm. It struck me as a smorgasbord. Would you agree that when you deal with someone who is leaving Islam, that they often may have multiple causes?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. They can have multiple causes.
And then I wanted to make one comment. When you talked about faith as an experiment, Jeffrey Lang, in another one of his books, talked about a friend of his who was an example of that, who had tried every religion there is, and including being Muslim twice. And the second time, when he finally left Islam, Jeffrey was very, very upset. And he went to him and he said, I don't understand. How can anyone become a Muslim to leave it? And his friend said, well, Jeffrey, you know me, I'm been a member of every religion that there is. And so believe me when I say this, of all the religions, Islam is the best. And of all the followers, the Muslims are the worst.
I agree with that.
All right, well now I want to, even though I have much more, I could get in a long conversation, but I know you want to too. So we have, yeah, well, we started about 15 minutes already. I don't want to take as much time out of the next.
Yes, mine is very quick. Is it possible to get access to your presentation?
Yeah, it's actually Facebook Live.
Oh.
So it's going to be recorded, and therefore you could just go on my Facebook, and the whole presentation is there.
Send me a link so we can link to it from our website.
Yes, send us a link and then we can put it on.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Right,
there's a lot
if
there.
we could put it on our
so
website.
Here it is. Great. It's actually live, and it will be available on my Facebook.
Oh, wonderful.
Yep, the whole link.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, can we go back to the slide on atheism and the categorizations of that? Hi, good morning, all. If you don't know who I am, I promise.
Did you want me to go back to each and every single one of them?
No, there's a one slide that you had that had, the one right before it. That one.
Yep.
Has that, so this is really, this is very phenomenal research.
Mhm.
Really phenomenal research. Have each of these categorized, like categories that you have created, have they been mapped specifically? Is there specific literature related to any of them? Is there any structure of like continuity in terms of like developmental theory that says that there's a process that people are going through? Because this is just so robust, and I would love to see like.
I know that there were some researches in sociology that were done in this, although sociology and psychology are usually atheist born,
Right.
very atheist born, and of course always looking at things as if they are not part of the study,
Yeah,
but they are outside of the study. And but at the same time, there are some studies, I can't remember right now, like on the top of my head, some of those studies that were done, but I did benefit from some writings in Arabic and some writings in English. And this was, this was generally just my translation and sometimes my wording for those types of atheisms. It's not necessarily an academic wording for that.
Sure.
So this is, I was trying to simplify it and at the same time clarify it.
Yeah, the thing that I would attest to it is that I think there's something here
Mhm.
that like deeper inquiry could give some real foundations
Right.
for, and based on the research that I've done, I resonate with this,
Mhm.
but I still think, and obviously we're all in
Right.
the research, we're all trying to like figure out
Right.
like processes.
Yep.
Develop.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
Thank you.
Go, thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Dr. Wazwaz, so much for your
Allah
presentation.
Islam.
I really appreciate it. It's a wealth of knowledge and a lot to still keep processing. One of the things I'm curious about other folks, I know we don't have time for a longer conversation, but one of the things that I see the most on the campuses that I'm on in particular is what you were saying about the intellectualism versus religion, and somehow that they're mutually exclusive, and if you're somehow a religious person, then you can't be an intellectual, and this kind of thing. And I think that's where some of the struggle is with a lot of my students. One in particular, I can't, I want to make sure. One in particular is it's a different phenomenon for the student. I'm curious if you face this. The student comes from abroad, and then so I think has lived in a certain kind of society and was struggling with some of the norms in that society, and then came here, and then of course was found more of a home in the structure of life here. But then that put her at odds with the tradition, and so we're trying to pull apart the culture, religion, and different ways of understanding Islam, and the ones that the very sometimes the narrow strict ways
Right.
that we.
I think I see
yeah.
where I think
Yeah,
I see
so
where.
what-
Here's one thing. I actually do a lecture many times. It's called Evolution of Muslim Thinking. The whole theme of that lecture is really to help the Muslims understand that not one type of Muslim group is necessarily encompassing Islam per se. So we can't necessarily say that Islam is Salafism, Islam is Sufism, Islam is Tabligh, but it's actually all. And this is very important, but it's actually all. Uniting the Muslim thinking, uniting the Muslim approach. I'm not talking about outside of Islam, but I'm actually saying to go back to Islam, that the only thing that can define Islam is really the text itself, Quran and Sunnah. If a text is what is called قطعي الدلالة or قطعي الثبوت, there's no question with that. قطعي الدلالة, قطعي الثبوت, meaning that it's authentic in its source. But قطعي الدلالة is that text does not have variant readings or variant interpretations that were regarded as authentic interpretations by scholars. Then there's no doubt that this is Islam. But not all texts are necessarily قطعي الثبوت, قطعي الدلالة, sorry. What does that mean? That not all texts necessarily have one way of reading it, but that's why in fiqh or in Islamic law, why we have the different schools and the four common schools, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, those are the most famous ones, but there are actually over 16 and over 20. So if there are that many, to exclude others and ostracize another Muslim simply because they might say, I don't believe niqab is obligatory, and to exclude her and consider her munafiq is an issue. And this is very common in where when we're actually coming to the West, we tend to see, let me say, the variant effects of different madhahib. So you will see Pakistanis are generally Hanafi, but the person that grew up in, let's say, Malaysia, who was Shafi'i, starts seeing that this Muslim Hanafi is somehow practicing a wrong type of Islam, because they don't understand the resource of it and where it comes from. I remember just a short story. I remember one time I was giving a lecture at St. Thomas University, not far from here. And the lecture was about women in Islam. And I was talking about a number of topics. And amongst the students was a Saudi student. You could see he wasn't necessarily religious and, different. So he came to me and he said, for the first time, I actually hear that Islam is based on Quran and Sunnah is actually okay with these different ways, if you would want to say it. He said, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. It was very Salafi, Wahhabi, whatever name you want to use. And he said, when I came here, I tried to implement my Salafi approach to things, and then I failed. So the term that he used, he told me, I divorced Salafism, but I didn't divorce Salafism alone. I actually divorced Islam and left Islam. That's exactly what he told me. He said, I left everything until you came, and I realized that what I thought was Islam was actually a very narrow understanding of how we read the world and how we understand the world. Alhamdulillah, the person, there were different conversations, but just to make the story short, is that it's very important to embrace Muslims and to embrace that there are different opinions between scholars and variant readings on a number of texts, and that actually brings in the different approaches, and at the same time that brings in a different understanding to things, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be that opinion that is right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a good note to end on. I've always felt that the center of Islamic thinking has moved around the world from place to place throughout history. And I always thought that this is the time and place for it. This is the place for it in this time. And the reason is because we have Muslims from so many different backgrounds in this society. And when two Muslims see that their way of living is different, one cannot say to the other, my way is right because this is the way my father did it. They have to go back to the sources, to the Quran and the Sunnah, and find out what is really going on. And sometimes to admit that it admits of multiple interpretations. So thank you very much, Dr. Sheikha, and thank you all. And I guess we're going to have a short break at least before the next. All right.
Inshallah. So my other topic, I think it's going to be later.
2 o'clock again, yeah.
And that's when religious leaders have a lot to say about that. All right. Assalamu alaikum.